In this recording, I'm going to give an overview of the general sort of health and safety procedures that you need to be aware of and you need to follow when working in the teaching laboratories. So this applies to both the Priestley and the Porter laboratory. So what I want to start with is just kind of give an overview of why it is important for you to think about health and safety. Now, what we have within the universities, we have various different committees above you at sort of school level, university level, where we think about, how can we make sure that you are able to do your lab work and do it safely. So we create sort of procedures and rules for you to follow. But what I really want to emphasize and highlight in this chart here is that you are also part of the process of being able to make sure that our labs can function safely as well. And so following the rules of health and safety isn't just about keeping yourself safe. It is also about keeping everybody around you safe as well. So that is your responsibility to make sure that not only can do your lab work safely, but other students can do their lab work safely. That demonstrators and staff can go and supervise you in the lab safely as well. Okay, it's a burden and a responsibility that you have as well, and the idea is that really all of us are working together to make sure that we all stay safe. We do have a SharePoint. There's a link on this slide, and you'll be able to access that through the slides that will be shared on Minerva. But if you click on that link, you'll find the safety procedures and documentation that are available for the School of Chemistry. They apply sort of school-wide. But what we try and do is we try and sort of take sort of the key aspects of working safely in the teaching laboratory, and we sort of place them in Minerva for you, so you can access them easily. But there are things available through the SharePoint as well. And whilst we try and take the measures that we can to keep you safe in the laboratory, accidents do still happen. Okay, and we can see here from this chart a log of the some of the accidents that have happened in the teaching laboratories over a couple of years. We have certain types of accidents that are common, sort of cuts to glassware, sort of handling corrosive chemicals, sort of leading to burns. Okay, now these numbers aren't aren't high. Considering the number of times you go into you do an experiment, the number of students that we have in the laboratory, but nevertheless, our aim is obviously for all these accidents to be zero, and so we are in a process of always improving how we make the lab safe. We're always reviewing the rules and procedures that we have, and you can see from some of the charts, we can, by improving our procedures, we can sort of make the levels of incidents sort of decrease as well. Okay, but you need to be aware that these things, accidents do happen in the laboratory, and you need to try and minimise them for yourselves and for others. And you can also see that by highlighting some of the most common sort of forms of incidents that we have, cutting of glass cuts, for example, that hopefully helps you understand why we are making you have certain training before you go into the laboratory. There will be a specialist glass safety training for you to complete, specifically because you can see here, glass cuts are quite common. And so something we want you to make sure you do is report any incidents that happens. I think what's also important is we want you to make sure that you report a near miss as well. So even if you don't have a particular accident, you became aware of something that was close to being an accident that could have harmed yourself or could have harmed others, let us know, okay? Because the way accidents work in the laboratory is, you know, most things don't lead to an incident. Most things, don't lead to a burn or a glass or a cut from glassware. But a few of them eventually do. They lead to that kind of minor uh, injury, where maybe you need a plaster or maybe you need to wash your hands or something like that. But if we have enough of these minor incidents happening as well, and we don't look and think about how we can sort of decrease them, then eventually they'll slip through that one person will end up having a major accident. Okay, so fortunately, these things are extremely rare. In most years, we do not have a major accident occurring in our laboratories. But again, to try and make sure this never happens in our labs, we need you to make sure that you report all the incidents that happen. So if you get a cut or a burn, or even if you just have a close call, let us know, okay? Don't try and sort of deal with it yourself, because what we do, as well as trying to sort of deal with your cut or your burn, we also look at how that happened and we think about how we can improve it for the future to make sure no student in future ends up with a minor injury, but most importantly, doesn't slip through into leading into a major incident as well. Okay, so here's what you've got to do to make sure that you can work into the lab and go into the lab and do your experiments safely. Okay, so the first thing to do at the beginning of the module is to follow and learn all the general health and safety procedures for working in the lab. We've got a special section in Minerva right at the beginning for you to work in. It's got all the training materials. This presentation is part of it, but there are other presentations, there are other tests for you to complete. And for each laboratory as well, we have a special test as well. It's kind of an induction test that just makes sure that you can sort of work in both Priestley and Porter safely. Okay, and you have to make sure you do that at the very beginning of this module. The other thing you need to do, and this is before you start any experiment, is you need to complete the pre-labs of every experiment, because part of the pre-labs also includes some health and safety in information as well. And the health and safety information in the pre-labs relate to specifically the equipment and chemicals that you're using for that particular experiment. Okay, so you've got the general stuff, which is about that you do at the beginning of the module, which is about making sure you can work generally in both labs safely. And then you've got specialist health and safety considerations for each experiment, and that will come through the pre-labs. Okay, and so in particular in the experiment script, you'll have some COSH information. It's the safety information for things like the equipment and chemicals that you're using, and some of the pre-lab questions will be around them as well, okay, to make sure that you can use those key pieces of chemicals or equipment safely. And the most important thing to note about this is that without doing the general health and safety training, without completing the required tests, and without completing the pre-labs tests of a particular experiment, you cannot go into either of the laboratories and start your experiment. Okay, so you have to make sure that this is all complete, or all the general health and safety stuff is completed before you start any of the experiments, and then before each of the experiments that you're due or scheduled to complete, you have to make sure that you complete the pre-labs as well. Without doing this, you'll just simply be turned away from the lab until you've completed the tests. Okay, so this next section is about some of the safety equipment that you and regulations that you need to follow when you're in the lab as well. So firstly, you need to make sure that you are wearing these pieces of equipment. So for all experiments that you're doing, you need to make sure that you are wearing a lab coat, so you'll be supplied with a lab coat to do this. You will also, in the laboratory, have access to disposable gloves. So in particular, when you're handling chemicals, you need to make sure that you are wearing gloves so they do not you don't get them on your skin. There are other forms of gloves as well, which I'll talk through in a few slides' time, that are for handling other to be used in certain situations. And then you also need some form of eye or face protection. Okay, you will be supplied with lab spectacles, and you'll also have access to lab visors as well. Okay, now you can choose which one of those two you prefer to use. Okay, but you have to make sure that you're wearing one of those two pieces of equipment to cover your eyes or face when you go into the laboratory. Okay, so in particular, as soon as you enter the laboratory, your lab coat, you must be wearing your lab coat, it must be fastened up, and you must have your lab specs or visor on when you enter the laboratory. So as soon as you go through those doors, those pieces of equipment must be on. The gloves, they're available in the laboratories themselves, so you can put them on when you get into the lab before you start handling any particular chemicals. So I just mentioned, I'd say some more about gloves themselves. So yeah, as I've already said, you want to make sure that you're wearing disposable gloves when you're handling chemicals. Something to be aware of then is if you are handling chemicals with your gloves, okay, you need to assume that these gloves are contaminated. Okay, you might not be able to see it, but you might get a small splash of a chemical, a small bit of powders of a chemical onto those gloves. So they become contaminated very quickly, okay? And so disposable gloves mustn't leave the lab. They must be disposed of, okay? And as soon as you can replace and replenish disposable gloves as many times as you want, okay? So as soon as you've got something on those gloves, just dispose of them and then put on a fresh pair of gloves, and that will minimize the contamination because once you've got a chemical on that glove, if you go around touching other pieces of equipment or glassware, then obviously you're spreading that contamination. So do make sure you change your gloves as often as possible. Okay, certain types of gloves are useful for certain types of chemicals. Okay, but the disposable gloves that we supply for you in the lab are safe to use for the chemicals that you're using in the experiments that we have for you. We also have some other forms of gloves as well, as you can see in the slides, and these are thicker gloves. Okay, and they're quite useful for handling particularly sort of hot or cold pieces of glassware. Okay, disposable gloves are used for sort of stopping your hands getting contaminated with chemicals, but they don't stop the transfer of heat. So if you're, like, say for example, putting some glassware in the oven to get them hot or dry, then rather than using disposable gloves, you should use some of these sort of thicker gloves that are near to you, that are sort of near to the ovens, so you can take your glassware, handle it when it's hot, and then just put those gloves back near to where they were you found them when you finish using them. Other things you might want to use these thicker gloves for as well is if you are handling maybe sort of needles, for example. It's harder to pierce your needles through these thicker gloves than it is with disposable gloves as well. Okay, so those are the sort of protective pieces of equipment that you have for you in the lab. The other thing you need to think about when you're in the lab is actually what you wear and how you're dressed as well, because you need to do that in a safe manner. Okay, so items can catch on instruments, they can get singed from flames if you're using Bunsen burners, for example. So it's really important that you keep things that are loose, sort of tied up, so they're out the way. So if you've got long hair, okay, then that should be sort of tied up in a ponytail. Okay, if you have other clothing that you wear, for example, think about if it's likely to be flammable or not. So hijabs as an example. We have we prefer you to wear cotton hijabs rather than nylon, because nylon is more flammable. But also, if you have some form of religious clothing that you need to wear, please bring a spare piece as well. So if, for example, if you have if you splash or spill a chemical on a hijab, for example, well, you'll need to change that because it's contaminated. So if you've got have a spare in your locker, then if that happens, then you'll be able to change it into your non-contaminated one, and somewhere safe as well. And another thing about thinking about what you wear as well, we've just talked about lab coats, specs, and gloves to sort of make sure you're covered up and you're not exposed to chemicals. Well, you need to make sure that your clothes sort of cover up your skin, so they're not exposed to chemicals as well. So shorts are not allowed in the laboratory, even on hot days. If you come into the lab with shorts, you'll just simply be turned away. Also, you need to make sure that you don't have any sort of bare sort of ankles or feet as well. So as this sort of picture shows, you need to make sure that you're wearing socks if you've got sort of short trousers, for example. Also, we don't allow open toe sandals, which expose your feet. You need to have sort of footwear that fully covers up your feet as well. Okay. Key thing is no skin on show. Okay, and then just some other things as well to do with contamination. I've briefly mentioned it about gloves. There's no food or drink allowed in the lab, as I've mentioned. You're exposed to chemicals in the lab as well. If you have food and drink in there, they're going to be chemically contaminated, and then obviously if you ingest that food, you're ingesting those chemicals. So food and drink need to be kept in your lockers. You need to make sure you regularly wash your hands. We've got sinks all over the lab, and in particular, when you leave the lab, we have a sink just next to the door. Make sure you wash your hands, because it's quite likely then you're going to be touching stuff outside of the lab. You don't want that to be chemically contaminated. Also, if you've got any sort of glassware that you're using, that's going to get contaminated as well. Most of your glassware you will wash after you've done your used it, so to remove the chemicals. Just to really know, if you break any glassware, obviously we don't want you to use that piece of glassware. We'll get you a replacement, but that glassware will be contaminated. Okay, so don't go sort of using your hands to sort of pick up the pieces of glassware. I've also shown with the slide earlier how cuts are really common. That's another reason not to handle the glassware. But this glassware is also going to be chemically contaminated. Use a dustpan and brush instead. Okay, and again, other things to be aware of when you are sort of using things in the lab to minimize contamination. As I mentioned before, if you get chemicals on your gloves, okay, and then you handle certain items like your phone, they're going to be contaminated as well. So, get in the practice of taking your gloves off if you're handling things that is kind of personal to you. So maybe things like your phone, or maybe if you want to write something in your lab book, that you don't want to contaminate your pens or your pencils. Okay, particularly if you're sort of minded to put your pen or pencil in your mouth, then you don't want to be contaminating that. Okay. Other things as well is to remember that your lab coat gets contaminated as well. So think about what you put in your lab coat pockets. Okay, as I mentioned before, food shouldn't be stored there in there anyway. But if you're putting other pieces of equipment in there that you then take out of the lab, well, that will be contaminated. So perhaps only keep things in your pocket that you only use in the labs. So things like maybe like a spatula, or maybe you have a pen or a pencil that you only use in the lab. You have a separate pen or pencil that you don't use in the lab for your studies outside. And also be aware of the fact that if you have a lab coat, you will be taking it out of the lab and it's going to be contaminated. Don't put it in your bag, because it will contaminate everything in your rucksack as well, especially if you're keeping your food in there as well. That's not a sort of good practice. So instead, maybe keep your lab coat in a carrier bag, a separate bag to your other items. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about hazards that are related to your experiments that you're using. So in every experiment, there is a what we call a list of the chemicals that you are using, what their hazards are, what precautions to take, as well as how to safely dispose of them as well. Okay, you need to, and here we've got an example with hydrochloric acid. Okay, so to help make sure that you can handle and use all the chemicals safely, you need to make sure that you look at these COSH forms that we have in your experiment scripts before you sort of start the experiments. You need to learn how to handle them safely. As I mentioned, they're also part of the pre-lab test. But another thing I also want to say is, if you forget about what the hazards of a chemical are, they are in your script. So before you're about to handle a chemical in the lab, if you've forgotten what the hazards are, make sure you just read your script again and find the information, and then you can make sure that you're definitely using and handling the chemicals safely. Okay, a lot of the chemicals that you're using are flammable. You'll be using heat sources such as hot plates and Bunsen burners, and fires can and have happened in the undergraduate teaching laboratories. Okay, the three things that make a fire or cause a fire to occur is you need a fuel source, so something like a Bunsen burner, or a or a flammable chemical. Lots of your solvents that are flammable, oxygen, and heat or ignition as well. Okay, and so you need to be fully aware of all the chemicals that or things that you're using that could be flammable, and just think carefully about how to avoid having a fire. So, for example, if you've got a beaker or a flask and it's got a flammable solvent in there, and then you start using a Bunsen burner, that's not safe. Okay, you need to either not use that Bunsen burner, use it somewhere else, or make sure that the flammable chemicals that you're using is far away, maybe even probably outside of the fume hood itself. So you're minimizing the risk of risk of that sort of catching fire. Other types of fires we've had in the past as well are where students have really heated sort of flammable solvents really high, so there's lots of fumes and vapors of that flammable chemical in the fume hood. The hot plate is really hot, it's electrical, it sparks, and it comes into contact with the vapors and it causes a fire as well. Okay, we have safe ways of evaporating and reducing the volumes of flammable chemicals that avoid that sort of ignition. Okay, so don't sort of heat flammable chemicals really high so it's bubbling away, so it's spilling over onto the hot plate, because they will cause fires. Okay. If a fire does occur, either in the teaching laboratories themselves or in another part of the chemistry building, okay, these are the key things you need to do. You need to stop what you are doing. It doesn't matter where your experiment is. Okay, the only thing that needs to happen with your experiment is you just need to stop it so it can just be left in a safe way. And the most likely thing that you're going to be doing if this needs to happen is you're going to be heating something. So if you're heating something on a hot plate, just take the beaker or flask off the hot plate, turn the hot plate off, or if you're doing like a reflux, for example, just turn the reflux off. Okay, that'll ensure that by no longer heating the reaction, you're at least leaving the experiment in a safe way. Okay, stop what you're doing. Leave your equipment. You don't need to take your lab coats off. The priority then is sort of getting out of the lab as quickly but as safely as possible. The staff and the demonstrators will sort of guide you nearest to the nearest safe exit, and depending on what exit you sort of follow, you need to wait in the safe designated area until the fire wardens have checked the incident and have given the all clear for us to go back into the lab. Okay, so this will either be sort of, if you go through the front side of the building, will be sort of outside in sort of the steps of the Parkinson building, or if you leave on the rear side of the building, you have to go through clock and waiting cloth workers courtyard. Okay, there is a whole section on how to dispose chemicals safely, videos that specifically go through various types of chemical and waste disposal and how to do that correctly in its own designated test. But I'm just going to quickly summarize how chemicals should be disposed of safely. So in the lab, we have various different waste containers. This is for solid types of waste. If you've got something that's not contaminated, which won't be a lot, but maybe something like a paper towel that you wash your hands with, for example, then we have a blue bin in the lab. Non-contaminated waste goes in there. But most of the things that you're using, things like filter papers, gloves, they should go in the chemically contaminated bin, which is a yellow bin instead. If you're unsure about something and you think you're unsure whether it's been contaminated or not contaminated, you're safer putting it into the chemically contaminated waste of the yellow bins. There are other types of waste which can't go in the yellow bins, however. Any glass that you've got needs to go in the glass bins. These are blue bins again, but they're round and they have a screw top on top of them. Okay, so any broken glassware, any disposable glassware like pipettes that you're no longer using, they need to go in the glass bins rather than the yellow or the blue bins. And if you're using needles, then they need to go in the sharps bins as well. We have sharp bins located in most of the bays as well. Okay, so that's where needles need to go. Okay, with regards to liquid chemical waste, most of the chemicals that you use are liquids, solvents, acids, bases. We can't just simply chuck or throw down the sink, as this diagram shows. It will then go into the environment, into the rivers and lakes and the seas, and they will cause damage to the environment. So instead, we have special waste containers for liquid chemical waste, depending on the types of liquid chemicals that you're using. And again, the waste disposal training will specifically cover how to handle and where to dispose of liquid waste. But you just need to remember from this particular talk at this particular time that you cannot simply just throw liquid chemical waste down the sink. There are certain chemicals that have to be located, placed into special waste containers. So like certain metals, for example, cannot be mixed in the normal sort of waste disposal containers. And so what you'll find in your lab script is this sort of hazard symbol, special hazard symbol next to when you're using the chemical, and it will tell you where to dispose of it. Also, there's advice at the bottom of the COSH forms about how to dispose of certain chemical wastes, but also to remind you in the script, you'll see this symbol on the side of the procedures as well when you're using certain chemicals as well. Again, the waste disposal training will cover this in more detail. Okay, and another type of specialist health and safety training you're going to get will be to do with glassware. Okay, so there'll be a special glass safety training video and a special sort of glass test that you need to complete. Okay, but what I've highlighted here, you've seen in the chart from the beginning of the presentation, glass cuts are common, the most common form of injury in the lab, and we want to sort of minimize that. And these examples I've shown here are from actual examples of students sort of breaking glassware through their experimental work in the lab as well. So we're showing you, it's not a made-up thing. This thing does happen. You need to follow the training and be really conscious and aware when you're handling equipment. You can see some of this is from just from clamping the glassware, from an example. You need to be careful when you're handling this glassware that you are doing so in a safe way that avoids the glassware breaking, which obviously then is how you get exposed to being cut from glassware. Okay, so that concludes this talk on the general health and safety procedures and rules to follow when you're working in the laboratory. As you can see, sort of started by giving an overview about why it matters, how it's important that you report the procedures, given an overview of what you need to wear when you're in the lab, what clothing you need to wear as well, what rules and regulations you need to follow before you start in the lab, the training you need to complete, the pre-lab tests that you need to do as well. And so now there is some more safety training that you need to complete. It will be specifically regarding glass safety and waste disposal. Okay, you need to look through that training videos and then complete all the health and safety tests that you need to do so you can start in the laboratories as well. And the last thing I want to sort of mention, really reiterate, is if there's any information that you've forgotten after seeing this presentation, okay, it's incumbent on you to look through this information again. The most important thing is that you know what the rules and regulations are, and sometimes that means you just have to look at things again and again and again. Okay, so if you've forgotten anything, look through the slides again or watch the presentation again until you feel really comfortable and familiar. That's the most important thing, is that you're happy following and comfortable following and knowing what the rules are. Okay, thank you very much.